mention of hey between,
which, just curious
between
to
two
get, I want
vowels
to get an answer from him.
is in the pronunciation of this period.
Yeah.
We have it in the Nash already. This is the way they were talking.
Yeah, but in the Genesis Apocrypha, you got both spellings.
Okay.
Right. You know, 2134, you have the same spelling as this. But in the next column, column 22, you have it with a hey, several times.
Right.
Yeah.
Father Fitzmyer, I just wanted to get. What if it turns out that the other brother is a famous rabbi, for example? What would you say to that? Would that speak to you that maybe the...
Well, then maybe that's the reason why he's identified as the brother of somebody.
Mm-hmm. Yeshua is a famous rabbi.
If it's Jesus of Nazareth, yeah. But that's a big if.
No, but if the other one's a famous rabbi, would that speak to you, lead you to believe that maybe this is that famous rabbi, Jesus?
Well, it's possible. But you got to prove to me that it's the same Jesus of Nazareth.
One of the problems is someone is saying that you have, particularly in the high priestly family, paponymy operating. That is the...
Named after the grandfather.
Yeah, naming the child after the grandfather. So you get, let's say, Shimon Yohanan, Shimon Yohanan, and so on down, generation after generation.
You have that here with Joseph. You have this here with Yaakov.
You have this here.
Yaakov bar Yosef bar Yaakov.
The Onayad house, you remember, has paponymy operating, generation after generation. So we don't know which Onias is at the inscription. And
of course, there was the other of the tradition too that is not adopted by Ashkenazi Jews today, where it's the same as this father and son have the same name. Ananas.
I thought that was not proper in Jewish tradition to have the
not in
unless the father's dead.
That's correct. But I'm saying that it's different. In the first century, you have.
Would it generally be the case that they name the firstborn?
It's difficult to say this.
But is this more weathered than the average offspring?
So it's much simpler.
The weathering, is that more so?
It's more.
Oded, make some room for Professor Lemire. I want to get him in the show. No, you guys stay there. Stay there. I just want to get Steve.
And this one is the original crake, actually, which.
It went so far. I didn't check the back.
Same as me, you know. And actually, he found another one here. It's very difficult to see, but now that he mentioned it, I can see the beginning. There is something. Oh, no.
With the light on the side.
Yeah, now with the light, it's better. Now you can look at it and see. Yes, now it's
1 hour.
Yes, that's good. You can see it.
I could only see the two circles. I don't see anything.
We need really special light.
By the way, I think that the LED...
it's upside down.
It's upside down.
I saw the man putting it, and we had the newspaper, the television people, and he put it on.
So that next week, we have a good picture with a resin light to see exactly the colorings. Maybe there is something in the middle. It's difficult.
We haven't seen it, but
Kerning and stay away from the medieval.
Doesn't kerning usually mean that
That's in modern terms.
sometimes you see this one.
Which one?
From our own collection has 3
and sometimes you have something which resembles menorah or in the middle of mountain.
There.
Right here.
I see that one.
Yes. The other one is here. Not as good, but if I shine the light here, you see at 8 o'clock, now is the pepper, is the point.
Okay.
But you know the original crack was not as wide as it is.
No, you know what happened was because we had to take it completely apart. And inside the crack was a lot of ancient corrosion. I mean, the crack has been there at least 1,000, if not 2,000 years old.
I see.
Because the buildup of the incrustation inside was quite thick. In order to mend it, she had to clean that this incrustation, but which is kept in a say,
Where are the
bottle.
fossils now? Have you taken anyone, each one?
Well, if I asked your permission that we would look under the
Yeah, it might be
microscope
interesting.
to see this. There are, for instance, there were tiny root hairs, which are fossilized, calcified.
Maybe go on the other side. Sorry, excuse me. How do you feel? This has been sitting on your balcony in your living room. How do you feel seeing it over here?
Well, I'm excited to see it again, especially after I heard about the cracks that it went through. What actually I see here for the first time are some of the ornamentations that I couldn't recognize. I saw only the circles, but now for the first time Ed assisted me to look. There are two rosettes at this side, and he mentioned to me that they found also some fossils within the crake. The crake itself is probably originated maybe even 2,000 years ago. I mean, it's quite difficult to find out, but maybe in future you will be able to examine the fossils. The work itself looks very nice. I mean, the conservation work, I think that Eva did a very nice job. And I like the way that they preserve actually you can see even where the cracks were. I'm sure that she could cover it in such a way that no one could see it with a naked eye. But I think it's the right way to do it. I also think that preserving the original crake is a good idea. It could be covered as well, but I think that's the right way how to show it, because that's how it was found, and that's the way that it should be preserved for future.
Great. Sorry, I keep watching. Go in the corner there. See if there's a nicer way to talk.
Nice to meet you. Very pleased to meet
Is it worth doing a tilt down from
Yeah, that's
some
what I
of
was
that?
thinking. Yeah, from the writing.
Pick one. I mean, pick one, Sim.
Well, here it says James over there, right over everybody. James identity or
I can't
something.
see quite clearly there. I can see the firstborn. You like that?
Ladies and gentlemen, you're not the only wonderful scholars. For 30 seconds, be wonderful actors. Instead of just standing there and we can't see anything, if you can kind of mill about for a bit. 30 seconds, we promise it won't look fake, even though it looks fake.
That's good. That's good.
I don't know.
Maybe just the modified.
White from the sides. Even from the.
Why didn't you do it?
Okay, thank you. Just even. Now see what I mean? Yeah. It looks just as, you can tell it's as deep as the rest of it. That's the trick of light, and that's why you have to have multiple
photographs.
When I saw it in the dull light of the packing room, I didn't even know which side had the inscription. So I mean, they did a fantastic job.
No, they did a wonderful job. What I'm saying is, any one light angle, you're going to lose some of the letter.
Critics have said that the last few letters are not very deep, but actually, Kyle's saying, depending on the light, they probably...
Other Ossuary 570 might be the signature of the artist, not the deceased.
Fortunately, you see the more important words actually, the brother of.
Right.
Yeshua.
Yes.
There is no doubt whatsoever. I mean,
well, I don't think that there's two hands involved.
There is no
I think
two
it's
hands.
one hand.
Yeah, it's
my question is why that's the whole thing.
You don't find that the first one because it's going through the letters so bright. Because I think some of my answer to this is that someone started doing it and they started feeding from
to my mind, the first part, the right-hand part, I think that's
Yeah. Well, it is. You can see some scratches on this thing here. If you're just trying to put... See, there's other signs.
The other side is more brownish. And the brown is going...
Just brush it off.
The more interesting thing, I think, is to look at it in the daylight. Have you seen it in the daylight? In the daylight, you don't see any.
Yeah.
It doesn't come sharp at all.
Yeah, here the light's very carefully.
Yeah.
It's probably also a question of shadow or things like that.
That's how we do it.
Rolled up and all.
Maybe,
I mean, I'm saying I don't see. It's a great difference, frankly.
Yeah, no, I mean, then
how do you account for the differences between the way the Yud is done in the first section and the nice area or whatever it is, the separate? What I found was that between the Aleph and the Ayin, it washed out completely. The Aleph and the Ayin are deep, as are uniformly all the first letters, and they keep their form, but all the rest gets washed out. Yeah. For what it's worth, it's not scientific, but
it shows something about light, maybe, or the way the lights.
Blood brothers, the Orthodox are going to say half brother, and the Roman Catholics are going to say kindred. What do you want to do with that?
That's fair, though.
Yeah. See, the other thing is that in the article I have in America, I said,
No, I just. All of us began to realize that they were sure about how
And the leader was James, not Peter. Peter was overseas traveler, but James was the big honcho that he had to report back to. So he describes meeting him there, and then he describes a debate on the temple steps where the priests and the scribes are debating the James group on the steps, and there's a riot. And all of a sudden, into this riot bursts who's called an angry man. And it's clearly meant to be Paul in his time when he's serving the Roman authorities. And he runs into this debate just when James is about to win, picks up a flagon from the altar and beats James with a club and throws him down the stairs and leaves him for dead. And there's a huge melee, and about 30 people are dead, but James isn't dead. This is the kind of detail this novel has. It carries him out of the temple and to a house in Jerusalem, which is also good detail. Then it takes them down to Jericho, outside, and then the enemy, as he's called, gets letters from the high priest to pursue the Christians to Damascus. That's the thing in Acts. That's where Acts picks up. You recognize that. So this is Paul. This is a representation. And he comes through Jericho on the way to Damascus, and he misses them, and they've carried James down there because he's the leader of the whole community. Anyway, they're out somewhere outside of Jericho. Guess where they are? Near Qumran. Near Qumran. Yeah, near Qumran. And so, that's the thing of James attacking Paul with it.
So you think this historical...
This is so detailed. What is it? What are they doing in Jericho? It's so rich in detail.
So Herschel didn't agree for you to do the article?
He didn't even know what I was talking about. He doesn't know anything.
Okay.
What do you give me your novel, sir?
He didn't want...
Pick a speed. Okay, let's start with the ossuary. So it's the real thing?
No, it is not the real thing. It's a very questionable thing. It's very worrisome, highly suspicious. Many aspects to it are challenge credulity.
Why?
Why? Well, there's a whole list of things. First, there's no secure provenance. Second, there's no secure chain of custody. Third, it comes willy-nilly out of nowhere. Suddenly appears on the scene just when James is being talked about. You know, for the last 5 years, there have been a series of books on James, primarily including my own, which is a 1,000-page Penguin, James, the brother of Jesus. And these books have been widely circulated. And in these books, one of the things that's said is perhaps the best proof of Jesus' existence was the fact that he had a brother James. 3 or 4 years after statements like this are being widely read, here pops the sarcophagus. That's the first thing that put my hackles up to worry about. It's the miraculous sudden appearance of this. The next thing, if you want me to continue?
Yeah.
Okay. The next thing that is worrisome about this box is the phrase, the brother of Jesus. Nobody at that time would have thought to put the brother of Jesus on an ossuary, not in the first century. Now, later, perhaps, after Christianity and its documents had time to dig in. The point was, James was rarely called this. James was famous in his own time. James was an overarching figure in Jerusalem known as the Just One. People used to walk up to James and touch his clothes as a holy man when he walked through the streets. He was probably a leader of a movement like the Essenes, if not the Essenes. Anyway, he was a tzaddik who everyone admired and knew about. Therefore, if you had an ossuary in his name, you wouldn't have to identify him brother of Jesus. He would be known in his own right. And it's like the person who added brother of Jesus wants us to know which James this was. So a later generation, or even someone in our own time, that's what I've said generally, that it's too pointed, it's too perfect. It's like, oh, hello, 20th century. Do you want to know who this is? It's the brother of Jesus, you know, and someone's written it out there. That's a second problem. But I would even worry about a third problem, the James, the son of Joseph, Jacob, the son of Joseph, the first part. Now I'll get to that in a moment. That's not to say the two problems with the inscription itself. Now, we had professional paleographers supposedly looking at this. Look, I want to tell you, even an amateur could see that there are two hands there and that the two parts of the inscriptions don't match. One is deeply incised in a formal style. When I saw it in the museum, I was staggered because the pictures don't do it justice. The pictures looks like they've been sort of, enhanced because you can hardly read the second part because it's so dim and it's done with such a clumsy tool. The first part just jumps right out, and it's not just because it's been clean. It's been done with a different, more precise tool. It's a formal hand. The second part is clearly added by a second hand with a different instrument even. It's not as deeply incised. It's more clumsily. It's like just a more clumsy instrument. Now, an amateur paleographer could tell you that. But the public is cowed. The public defers to these specialists and is unwilling to use its own judgment. So there are two parts to this inscription. Now, I've dealt with the second part a little bit. The first part is worrisome for the following reasons. Okay, there may be 200 or 300 people called Jacob the son of James in the area of Jerusalem at this time. I wouldn't even want to estimate how many there might be.
You mean Jacob son of Joseph?
Jacob son of Joseph, right. I mean, yeah. Maybe 200-300.
Sorry, there's overlap?
There may be 200-300 people in the Jerusalem or its environs at this time called Jacob the son of Joseph. But the problem with this particular inscription is that it is too clean. It is too new. There are rosettes in the back of the ossuary that are rubbed out. Where is the where from nature? Where is the, forget the patina argument. People have said on both sides of that, I'm not an expert on patina, that it can be faked. I've heard from a lot of antiquities people that this is normal practice in the unfortunate market of unreliable antiquities, that this is happening in a widespread way. But in any case, put the patina argument aside. Where is the natural wear and tear on that particular inscription that you see, for instance, on the rosettes on the other side and the inscription on the left? Now, the final part of that, James, the son of Joseph, which is worrisome. No ancient sources really call James the son of Joseph. In fact, they try to make a point that Joseph isn't the father. That he's not only not the father of James, he's not even the father of Jesus. God is supposed to be the father of Jesus. And I've always thought that the term Joseph was a symbolic term, going back to who Jesus' tribal father was. That is, Joshua's tribal father, as you probably know, was the tribe of, Joshua's tribal father was the tribe of Joseph. It's Joshua, son of Joseph. Also in Jewish culture, we have two messiahs, the Messiah ben David and the Messiah ben Joseph. And this seems to fit in with those kinds of allusions. In the actual text, we hear that James is the son of Cleophas and Mary, or someone called Cleopas and Mary. Another document in the Gospels calls him James the son of Alphaeus, a corruption of Cleophas. So we have lots of names whom James may have been the son of. This Cleophas character, you see, is how the Gospel of John uses this character to develop the idea that James is not really a brother of Jesus, but his first cousin. Because in the Gospel of John it says, Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and her son, James, Joses, Simon, and so on, the four sons, and the daughter Salome. So normally in the tradition, James is considered the son of the uncle, Cleophas, Alphaeus, unless Cleophas and Alphaeus are Joseph. So even the Joseph part from a specialist, who I consider myself to be, and honestly, the people we're talking about may be specialists in paleography or patina, but they're not specialists in history and text, and they don't know these traditions. Those are many of the reasons why I worry about this inscription.
But on that...
Sorry for that long-winded response.
No, we can edit.
I'm sure.
Where are you? I'm good. Are you good? Yeah. Does he need to turn towards me a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean...
Yeah. Stop.
This way.
Stop.
What I'm getting is because of all the movement, I'm getting some...
I move. I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay. No, I'm getting some glasses hit lights. That's
I mean, I'll take them off if you want.
Do you see without them?
I can see you. But we've done this much with them. Come on, might as well continue.
Oh, yeah, put the glasses in.
I'm handsomer with the glasses.
So it's only now and then that I get it depending.
Covers up my ugly eye insets.
So you okay?
Yeah, it's good.
So, I'm not a scholar on this matter, but I thought there were two Jameses. There was a Cleophas, and he's seems to be a cousin, there's a bunch of Jameses.
No, Cleophas is supposed to be the brother of Joseph.
Of Joseph. So that doesn't preclude the idea that Joseph also had a son named Yaakov.
Well, let's not get too Byzantine about this. I mean, we get multiplication of Marys, multiplication of Jameses, multiplication of Johns, and the main reason for that is, it's in my book, if your viewers read it, is as the doctrine of the supernatural Christ went forward into the 2nd century, brothers became cousins, fathers became uncles, mothers even turned into their own sister. In the Gospel of John, we get Mary, the sister of Mary, which is a tautologist impossibility. But that's how John has the character, Mary, the sister of the mother of God. So Mary is not even the mother of God in John, because John is pushing the family away from Jesus as the supernatural Christ, and the perpetual virginity of Mary came into being. So I wouldn't worry about this multiplication of like-named persons. I sort through all that.
But if there was, to you, is Jesus a historical figure?
He is an historical figure insofar as his brother is an historical figure. Jesus is an historical figure insofar as his brother is an historical figure. I said in the article I wrote recently, it isn't the question whether Jesus has brothers, there for sure. It's the question whether the brothers have a Jesus. And what I meant by that is, Jesus is historical, but the documents about him may not be reliable. The problem is the documents about him are so beloved, so much part of our culture, that people have a knee-jerk reaction to them. Oh, Jesus, son of Joseph and Mary. All these are like shibboleths, platitudes of our society. The point is that there certainly was a Jesus, but what we know about him is very dim and indistinct, and those documents were written a good deal further along in time, and often retrospectively, and with an agenda. They were written primarily from a Pauline Gentile Christian point of view to make the Jesus figure, in typical Hellenistic writing, the writers claim the figure, the way Plato claimed Socrates, make the Jesus figure more or less a mouthpiece for their position. So I don't accept the narrative picture of Jesus. I do think that the picture of James would be very much like what Jesus would have been.
So in a way, to get to the historical Jesus, you have to go through James.
There you go. Once you've solved the problem of the historical James, you have willy-nilly, you've got the end of my book. Solve the historical Jesus. The last sentence in my book read, who and whatever James was, so was Jesus. Because these two brothers were obviously very close. One succeeded the other. The other died much, much earlier. The facts about him have been overwritten by all kinds of theological and other Gnostic tendencies over several centuries until we finally get the potpourri in the final form we call the Gospels. These Gospels develop in the form we know them over 2 or 3 centuries. There may be early parts to them, but there are much later parts too. So that's retrospective writing. It's sort of like going to Hollywood and telling the script writer, now you write the script here to the basic details from that perspective. So one writer will write it from that perspective, another writer will write it from this perspective. If I were the writer, I'd be writing it from the Jamesian perspective. That gospel hasn't been written yet.
Given all these...
Oh, let me throw one other thing, if I could, in that. This is a really important point. You might be able to get some use out of it because I want to pop it in. You ready? Let me throw one important thing in on that. Those of us who know how important James was and what an overarching, he was the tzaddik of his generation. Everyone deferred to him, all parties. He was like the Ayatollah of his period, I would say. I don't like to call him that. Or even the bin Laden of his period. I don't think he was that violent. He's called the righteous, so I don't think he was an unjust man. But that's the stature he would have had among all the opponent groups. They circulated around him. Now, I don't need an ossuary to prove to me the importance of James. I already knew the importance of James, and those of us who have been writing about him for 20, 30 years have no doubts about this. The public at large is only just hearing of him. But what bothers me about this whole debate is the fact that the people who have discovered this, they don't really care about James. They're not interested in James. They were no more interested in James now than they were beforehand. All they're doing is using the ossuary to prove the existence of Jesus. The point I made in Roman numeral 23 of my book in 1997, that the best proof of Jesus' existence was the fact of a brother James. James could care less about James. That offends us. We feel you should be looking at James. James is the key person in this time and place, and here we have, if it's an authentic ossuary, a wonderful evidence of him. Let's get into the James thing. Let people learn about James. It's a rich history and an exciting history, and they will be challenged, and they will be extended, and they will not be sorry for having discovered this marvelous person.
Why do you think that James, if Jesus is overlaid with all kinds of stuff, script writing, why do you think James is more accessible than Jesus?
Because nobody cared about James. Nobody cared to overlay him with anything. He was like shunted aside, marginalized. You know, he was the head of the movement in Palestine, where the Paul-Peter axis took over the movement overseas. Now, you know some Jewish history, I'm sure, and you know that after the disappearance of the Jerusalem Center in the war in 66 to 70, ending in Masada in 73, there was no more Jerusalem Center of revolutionary activity. I mean, all that, and these groups, I would call them messianists at this point. They're not Christians yet. Paul says, quoted in Book of Acts, that Christians were first called Christians in Antioch in Syria. That's northern Syria in 55. So it was overseas they got the name Christians. In Palestine, at this time, they were never called Christians. What were they called? Well, in my work, we think they're called Essenes, Zealots. Some early Christian work says that the Zealots and Essenes were combined. There were Zealot Essenes, and there were Sicarii Essenes. A Sicarii Essene would be the most extreme, a terrorist Essene. Most people think of Essenes as little, pietistic people praying and doing nothing else. No, they were very aggressive Essenes, as the Dead Sea Scrolls show. And these terrorist Essenes were perhaps the worst group. I think James was the tzaddik for all these groups, sort of like the grandfather of the mountain, the bin Laden, for all of these groups around which all these groups revolved. But they were all opposed to Roman power in Palestine. That's why they were all liquidated.
The term zealot, some people argue that that's a much later term.
Josephus doesn't use the term right away. He calls it the fourth movement in his work. But these are very specialized questions. But by the time of the takeover of the temple, he's calling one group among them zealots. The actual group, probably the James group, because this is the group that actually killed the high priest that is responsible for the death of James. And you see in a sequentiality there. Like-minded groups have like enemies. The group, excuse me, I'll pick up there. The group that occupied the center part of the temple under Eleazar in the 60s, Josephus starts to call zealots. Earlier he called them many other names, but zealot, he is using that. And he also is using Sicarii from the 50s. And the Sicarii, are the ones who take over Masada. We consider them zealots, but they're actually Sicarii, a more extreme group of zealots. But it's all part of the same tree. But these zealots in Jerusalem, in the middle of the war, who are occupying the temple, there are three different parties all fighting with each other, but these are occupying the temple. They're the ones, with the help of these violent Gentiles, the Idumeans as they're called, rampage through the city, kill all the high priests, which shows it's an anti-priestly uprising, including the one responsible for the death of James, Ananus ben Nanus, who I think that they actually, Josephus says they desecrated his body and threw it out of the walls without clothes, naked as food for jackals. They didn't have a great high affection for him. And I think they actually urinated on his body and things like that before they threw it out in the city. This was the desecration, and probably cut off a few sexual parts in the process. And this is part of what the viciousness they felt towards this person, the killer of James. It was a tough time.
These are early Christians we're describing?
Christians? Well, there are no Christians in Palestine at this time. I just made that point. Christians is something as an overseas movement. It develops in northern Syria, in Egypt, in Asia Minor. Christians don't exist in Palestine before the fall of the temple. These are parties, Jewish parties, extreme. You want to call the Dead Sea Scrolls Christian? They're not Christian. But we have to speak about them. People say, oh, Eisenman, you call the Scrolls Christian. I don't call the Scrolls Christian. I have to use vocabulary that exists. These are extremist Jewish groups, messianists. That's what these groups are, messianists. Later on, messianists gets pacified in the Roman Pax Romanum and turns into what we call Christianity. In other words, its fangs are defanged. You want to know how its fangs are defanged? Read Paul, Romans 13. There, Paul tells you that the God has given favor on behalf, judgment on behalf of the Roman Empire. Those are the officials that we must obey, that the wearing of the sword bears its own reward, and you should pay your taxes to Rome because that's what God demands of you. Now, this is a new law, not Jewish holy law, which in the Temple Scroll says you shall not put a foreigner over you. Paul says you should pay your taxes to Rome, and you know the final thing that he uses to justify it all? Because you should love your neighbor as yourself. This is the key James passage, the royal law of Scripture in the letter of James, love your neighbor as yourself. Paul applies it to paying Roman taxation. That shows how cynical he is. That shows how he's laughing at these groups. He had a total contempt for these groups. He takes the most precious documents and turns it into a collaborationist exercise of, oh, you want to know, this is why you should pay taxes, because you should love the Romans as yourself. This is an incredible period, which is why I pray and hope that people who care about this period, religious people and non-religious people, will get deeper into it, because there's so much more out there to challenge them, and they're just being given the scratch of the top of the surface. Back to the Ossuary.
Leave the Ossuary for 1 second.
You don't want all this stuff in your thing, huh?
Sure, I want to stand James for the, if we're going to deal with the Ossuary. What?
You asked me to pause, or?
No, it's all right. We're just chatting. It's okay.
Let's see if I'm going to say how I understand.
Simcha's a good questioner.
I'm going to tell you how I think your thesis runs, and then you tell me, nah, it's not true, or yeah, or whatever. It's just to get people can't hear my questions.
That's all right. I like your questions.
Yeah, okay, so.
You're better than the interviewer yesterday.
Okay, good.
He had a cloth.
Oh, okay. Here's my thing. I think what I got from, I haven't finished your book.
I dare say.
What I got is this. There's a historical Jesus, and there's a mythical.
Mythologized
Jesus.
Jesus.
Mythologized. The mythologized Jesus is universal. He's above the law. He loves Gentiles.
Right. He eats with prostitutes and sinners. He does with tax collectors.
The historical Jesus, on the other hand,
he multiplies loaves and fishes.
And all these parochial Jews, they're little, they're into the law, they're this and they're that, and they don't understand Jesus among them. In reality, if you want to get to the historical Jesus, you go to James, and what you find out, it's the opposite. It's the guys who are against Jesus that are actually the universalists, if you will. They're Hellenized, they're collaborating with the Romans.
Right.
And the historical Jesus is actually parochial, zealot,
right.
Into the law, into the is that
right, exactly. You're exactly extreme.
Okay,
that's exactly.
You summarize kind of your thesis like it.
Well, it's hard because you see, it took me a long time to develop the thesis. Yeah, but you're smarter than me. You're smarter than me. You know, I mean, it's all swim. Oh, not me. Look, the thesis is that by doing the search for the historical James, you're not only going to find James, you're going to also understand what the Dead Sea Scrolls were and come to the true picture of this period. Let me give you an example, including who Jesus had to have been, because he couldn't be the person Paul. You know, Paul's view of Jesus is determined. First, he never met him, and he admits that. Second, he persecuted Christians, and he admits some unto death. It's part of my thesis in my book that Paul had a hand in the death of John the Baptist. And you'll see why, because they're both in the same place on missions at the same time, and Paul is on a mission to one of John the Baptist's enemies at that time. He only has a contact with a supernatural Christ in heaven, as he calls him, Christ Jesus in heaven. Paul has apocalypsios. It's the Greek word for vision. He has visionary spirits, visionary experience of a Christ Jesus in the clouds. He never met the earthly Jesus, so his Jesus is the heavenly Jesus. That Jesus tends to be a reflection of his own persona and the doctrines that Paul thinks that Jesus should have preached. But, that's why he was laughed at by the people in his own time. He said, who is this Johnny-come-lately? Who is this newcomer? Who is this bounder? But he had certain advantage of them. He was well educated. He was a Pharisee. He came from an upper-class family, probably a very, very wealthy one. He had a Roman citizenship. He wasn't a simple little fisherman or a cobbler or something like that. he had it all over them, and he took them to the cleaner in his discussions. They couldn't hold a candle to him. But he is extremely cynical. Now, going over to the other part, take this doctrine, this document that's recently been labeled MMT. You've heard of that. It's a letter, presumably from the head of the community to a king of some kind. It's a very convoluted letter. It's the only letter among the Qumran corpus. It's probably from the righteous teacher to some king. Well, it depends when you think the righteous teacher lived. I think the righteous teacher lived in the 1st century. I give a lot of reasons for thinking that, and it's too complicated for this discussion. But if you look at that carefully, you'll see that that letter contains the actual directives James makes in the book of Acts to overseas communities. It makes it, though, from an unfamiliar way, not from the smoothed-up, Hollywoodized, a slick way Acts presents these things in 3 points: abstain from blood, things sacrificed to idols, strangled things, and fornication. In MMT, it's convoluted. Things sacrificed to idols is a subject of about 70 lines, not taking things sacrificed to idols. Fornication is another 20 or 30. Blood is assumed. Carrion appears in certain of the intuitions there. So that letter would be a parallel to James's letter to overseas communities delivered to northern Syria. So what is my conclusion? You'll take a Qumran document, it'll look so alien and so abstruse that you won't see it as a Christian document. But in fact, that's the original. The other's been sort of given the blow-dry job.
Reload.
Blow job.
good interview.